Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. On the 5th of November, America heads to the polls to choose between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in an election characterized by ongoing political scandals, economic debates surrounding inflation and federal deficits, and shifting voter demographics. It's also the first US election since the public release of generative AI tools, and their effect on electoral information integrity remains to be seen. We asked our journalist fellows what role they thought emerging technologies would play in shaping the narrative of the 2024 US presidential election. 9% thought it would provide new opportunities for data-driven storytelling. 18% thought it might facilitate more real-time reporting and engagement. 27% thought it might amplify misinformation and polarization, and 45% thought it would create increasing challenges in maintaining journalistic integrity and trust. Our guest today is Alex Burns, head of news at Politico and author of the Tomorrow column. Alex is also a board member of Harvard's Institute of Politics and formerly served as national political correspondent for the New York Times, where he covered the 2020 presidential election. We'll ask for his thoughts on effective political coverage in 2024, the role of international relations in this election, and the value of original information in America's first post-AI campaign. That's The Briefing. Let's begin.
Well, hello and welcome to everyone that's joined in across the world. That last shot in our video was quite evocative of how things have transpired for leaders across many key countries, including the US and, of course, parts of Europe. As you heard, Alex Burns has had a steady eye on that for many decades now. Alex, thanks for joining in. Let's jump right into it. And fortuitous timing, really, with an upcoming debate between the two candidates. They have debated before in 2020, twice from memory. For starters, shall we just sketch out the two key actors, if you will, where on the one hand, you have President Biden, perhaps positioning himself as a protector of democracy, someone who's had some bipartisan successes, a stabilizing force, also the oldest president, if he does come back, to hold that appointment. And on the other hand, Trump, who lost the elections in 2020, does have a slew of legal cases against him, somewhat dwindling support perhaps within the Republicans, but still a very, very strong support base. Would you say that would be an accurate sketch of the two key speakers?
Essentially, yes. And just first of all, I want to say thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody who's joining us. I think that's basically right. I think the only thing that you said that I would modify is about the characterization of Trump's support within the Republican Party. He has shed support from Republicans over the years, particularly Republicans who are closer to the political center, particularly women and more educated Republican voters. But what he's done instead is bring in a different set of voters, more working class voters, rural voters who are historically Democratic, and they now consider themselves Republicans. So because of the way our political sort of self-labeling works in the US, Trump's support within the Republican Party looks stronger than ever. It's just that it's a different Republican Party than it would have been a decade ago. It's a different set of people who are calling themselves Republicans.
Let's sketch this out as well in terms of how Politico addresses this or approaches this in terms of its reporting, because we've got a unique gathering here where I imagine a bulk of those listening to you are journalists, so they sort of live, breathe, eat everything to do with news. What's Politico's audience been like, and how have you sort of sharpened your news in the run-up to the elections, keeping that audience in mind?
Well, I think that this is it's an important election. In absolute terms, it's an important election for the media. I think for Politico, it's a very significant election in our history. We're about 17 and a half years old now. We started really with the sort of supernova election of 2008, where Americans just tuned in and participated in a really different way. And we've had a sequence of elections since then, with the possible exception of 2012, that were really characterized by a kind of high drama, both in terms of the personalities involved and in terms of the substantive stakes involved. We've not had a boring election since then. This is an election that's, and many people would say, unfortunately for us,
and the world, we're watching.
this is a tricky election because it is the stakes are enormous, and also the country's not that interested in it. Like voters are not following it that closely. Readers of the news, I think this has affected Politico less than other news brands because of who our audience is to start. But I think it's been reported the Washington Post's audience has fallen by 50% since Trump left office. And so it's this challenging moment where the stakes are unbelievably high. Public engagement is not similarly intense. So, again, Politico's audience is a little bit different. We're not a paper of record. We're not speaking to 100 million people a day, and we're not trying. We are speaking to people who are most engaged in politics and policy, whether that's because they actually work in government, or it's they work in an adjacent sector, or they're just in a sort of a quite high decile of interest in politics and policy. That makes this a really important election for us to prove that we can deliver on our promise to readers that we're going to narrate the dynamics of power and the substantive stakes of policy with more insight and precision than the papers of record. If all we do is generate strong traditional campaign journalism mode of the New York Times or the Washington Post, we've not succeeded. The way we're going about that, and I'll just be brief about this, we are laser focused on the substantive policy stakes of the election, particularly in the spaces of climate, energy, defense, and healthcare. These are places where we have enormous reporting staffs, both here and in the UK and continental Europe. And we also have a smaller but incredibly productive legal team. And I think our sort of organizing approach to this is to treat the policy story of the election as the main story of the election, and the legal story of Donald Trump as the main story of the Trump campaign.
Mm. You raise a really important point about what's at stake here, Alex. And from the lens of journalism itself, because there is, I mean, this is a Trump 2.0 in a sense. So, there is some lived experience on what that looked like. What would you say is at stake for journalism itself in the run-up to this election and working on the possible outcome of a second run for Trump?
So I would say that there's a lot at stake for journalism, either in a second round of Trump or in a second term of Biden. And I don't mean to draw an equivalence between the disruptions that those would represent, but I do think that there is a risk. And I think this is let me not jump ahead, but I'll get to the point that I was about to make. I think there's a risk in characterizing a second Trump term as total chaos and a second Biden term as comparatively steady as she goes. And comparatively, it probably is a relatively steady. But if Biden is reelected, he will be the oldest president ever, one of the most unpopular presidents ever to start a second term. He will probably not have control of Congress. And so that would be not Trump level turbulence in all likelihood, but that would be a challenging, there's no outcome in this election that leads to an easy 4 years for the United States or our allies and friends around the world. So I do think in preparing Americans to vote and in preparing our readers globally to understand our election, I think the test for Politico specifically is, can we tell revealing stories anchored in original reporting on the biggest issues of the campaign, such that whatever the outcome is, the people who read us or listen to us or watch us feel that they understand what the power dynamics of 2025 are going to be. I would consider it a really serious failure if Politico readers didn't understand with really great precision what Donald Trump would do in a second term to the climate policies of the Biden administration, right? I would also consider it a really significant failure if we didn't articulate to readers why, and I think you and I'm sure a number of participants here understand this better than most Americans, no matter what outcome we have in the election, I think there are going to be a set of changing attitudes about security and America's place in the world and the international economy and China, that no matter who the president is going to be unnerving to much of the world.
Let's pivot to the here and now and the debate that people will be tuning into in the run-up to that. Some polls, including with organizations like The Economist, are pointing towards a small but significant lead for Donald Trump. How do you think both are going into the debate, and what do you think sort of the key pillars are going to be in that discussion? Because as you said, it's sort of broadened in terms of categories to debate. Does it go down to the core issues of immigration and female reproductive rights? Has that broadened debate?
I think those are the two key. I think you just identified the two key issues. And then I would just add broadly the electorate's frustration with the state of the economy. Donald Trump has benefited enormously in this campaign from people sort of, as they look back on his term, they mentally skip over COVID and just think about how the economy was kind of humming along in 2019. And that's nostalgic, but it helps for Trump. And Biden has sort of cycled through a series of arguments about the economy. First the argument that happy days are here again, right? That we're roaring out of the COVID recession, and second that he's making. Okay, I understand that people are frustrated with sort of specific things about the cost of living, but here are some specific things we're doing on the cost of living. That has not really resonated yet, right? So I do think there's a burden on Biden to show that he can make a focused and persuasive argument on the economy. But yeah, I think the border and abortion and sort of reproductive health more broadly, I think are going to be the biggest, most significant issues, at least that the electorate is thinking about. Sort of my question going into the debate about, and I think there's going to be a real challenge in how to cover this. Those are the issues that are clearly top of mind for voters that we need to hear the candidates engage on tomorrow. But I think it's an open question whether anything will resonate more than just the visual impression of these two old men, going at each other on stage, and people making an impressionistic judgment of which of them is more mentally acute, right? That Biden, you mentioned at the top that he has seen that he presents himself as this sort of figure of stability, right? And I don't think he's perceived that way by much of the country, right? That he's perceived as this kind of remote spectral president, an old man who's mostly invisible much of the time, right? But there have been moments like his last State of the Union address where he presents with more force. And I think it's an open question whether anything will be more significant than his presentation, by that metric tomorrow night.
Yeah. My apologies for this wailing sound in the background. Maybe the world is feeling the pressure of an election year and sounding it out. I'm just looking at data, Alex, on what's happening with young people, because all of what you raise is so very vital for that section of audiences. The numbers from Brookings Institution, for instance, point to much less political engagement in 2022. Those between the age of 18 to 29 voted at a rate of 31%. That's compared to sort of the high 40s for other age categories. This is, of course, nuanced even more when you're looking at different communities, whether it is, the African American community or the Hispanic Americans. What's in the journalism for young people to hold on to feel like they are seen and represented, and to really give them context on what's going on here? Because I'm just drawing parallels with what's happening in the UK as we speak, where elections happen next week. And honestly, cost of living is slap bang in the center of everything. Everyone feels it so acutely, and it is definitely sort of a plank on which people are going to make their vote.
So I think it's cost of living, and I think reproductive health, but more broadly also attitudes about gender and sexuality are clearly at the center of our election. And when I say sexuality, I mean just down to sort of fundamental social mores about what kinds of relationships and what kinds of like what does a family look like. That all that stuff has been thrust back into the middle of American politics in a way that it had sort of stepped, sort of faded into the background for a couple of years now. It really is front and center again. And I do think that for particularly for young people who maybe the first president they remember is Barack Obama, there is a real jolt in I am old enough to remember when the notion of same-sex marriage was seen as highly exotic, right? Or when Democrats being totally supportive of abortion rights was seen as potentially a political liability. And if you became politically conscious in like 2013, you don't remember that world. And then I think the Trump era came as a really sharp shock. And certainly the overturning of Roe v. Wade came as a deeply, in many cases, traumatic event, right? A very scary event for people of many ages, but I think particularly for young people who just felt like, where did this even come from, right? I think those issues and cost of living combine to really be at the center of the political conversation among younger voters, and the war in Gaza. And that's where it becomes very challenging for the American center left, I think, as in most countries, relies on young people more than the right does. And President Biden's in a position where he has an agenda on abortion rights and gender and sort of broad social values about identity and equality that ought to put him ought to make it, by sort of on paper, ought to make him the favorite choice of younger voters. But and I think it's the same in the UK, or very similar in the UK, the huge share of the younger electorate for whom supporting Israel's conduct in the war is a total deal breaker, right? And so this is something that I think the White House initially thought would sort of blow over, both because I think they believed the war would end sooner, and also that I think they didn't quite take seriously enough the anger among young voters, particularly young voters on the left, about what's going on there. So that's the bind that the Democrats are in. I do think the challenge for media, or a challenge for media anyway, is to address the concerns that are top of mind for voters of all ages, including the ones we just described, but also focusing on issues that are less an issue like student loans, an issue like housing regulation. These are actually not top of mind in American presidential politics. They're not, the candidates don't talk about this stuff every day, but younger voters do care about them a lot, particularly the housing issue, and figuring out that balance, covering how the candidates are engaging young people and whether it's working versus covering what young people are thinking about on their own terms as just a constant push and pull.
But you would say Israel and Gaza is a big enough topic in terms of its unifying nature for younger populations to make a voting decision on it? And is journalism and reporting reflecting that right now on trends within the United States?
I think that I wouldn't call it a unifying issue among young people, because I think there's a diversity of opinion. But among the young people who care about it, it's disproportionately, again, not unifying, but the great majority is clearly skeptical of Israel, or very critical of Israel. And is it enough of a voting issue to be a problem for Biden? Absolutely. One of my colleagues, Charlie Matessian, wrote a really excellent magazine story, I think about 11 months ago, about how the growth of college towns across the American Midwest had made a number of key states almost impossible for Republicans to win. That the explosion of population growth in like Madison, Wisconsin, or Ann Arbor, Michigan, had created a very, very serious political roadblock for Republicans. That might be less the case now if a whole lot of those younger people stay home because they don't like Donald Trump, but they're also not going to vote for a candidate like Biden who supports Israel.
I do want to talk about some of those swing states, including Wisconsin, Michigan. But more numbers. The Medal School of Journalism this time, where 2.5 local newspapers in the US closed every week in 2023. That's their figure. And by their estimate, by the end of 2024, the US will have lost a third of its newspapers since 2005. We're now dealing with the terminology of news deserts. This is happening, of course, more acutely for local communities. How well or poorly informed do you think people are in this very critical election, as you point to? And who's responsible really between the journalistic industry, organizations that should support free and fair journalism, and perhaps civil society at large, in order to ensure not just that they are better informed, but better represented? It's not about giving them a voice, but about the fact that their voice isn't present.
So I think I'm a little bit contrarian on this one. Look, for the most part, I think the electorate is not sufficiently informed. I also think that we're living in a time when it is easier to have access to high quality information than it's ever been in all of human history. It's easy to get, it's also easy to get deluged in low quality information, but I can go online and read the Arizona Republic or the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and find out what's going on in those states in a way that when I was in college was just not, maybe when I was in college, when I was in high school was not really possible, right? I can find out, and I do, I follow the UK election like hour to hour, right? In a way that, again, when I was a kid, you really couldn't do. So I do think there's a level here at which we do, it's not sort of popular to say it, but I do think the burden of responsibility falls on voters themselves. That if you're choosing not to seek out high quality information at a time when it's more abundant and available than ever, there is a demand side problem here, right? That if people are satisfied to sort of scroll through TikTok, there's only so much we in the media can do. I don't say that to sort of absolve us of responsibility. I think media has made very serious mistakes over the years. But I also think, anyone who's ever been on a diet can sort of, I think, can relate to the experience of like, I know I should be having this thing that's high quality, but I'm going to have like this fast food or something, right? And it does feel like consumers in the news business are just like consumers of just like diners are disproportionately making poor choices. Now, I think in the news business, we were all institutionally far too passive in adapting to the internet and confronting the sort of calamitous threat to the business from big tech, right? The way that the big tech companies just devoured the advertising model for the vast majority of newspapers. It's apocalyptic, right? And that is a sort of a shame on us reality, not for the most part the mistake of reporters, but certainly media companies. Now, I think the challenge that we all navigate in this period of real scarcity in the media industry, or certainly relative scarcity in the media industry, is can we continue to fulfill a really rigorous journalistic mission that can speak to a large audience rather than becoming anchored in big news organizations that need to find revenue. I think are increasingly dependent on whether it's subscribers or advertisers. They are, I think, more captive to the sort of whims of the market than ever. And I think that's really dangerous. And I think that when a news outlet decides abruptly we're going to pivot to video because the Facebook algorithm rewards it and lays off half the staff, and then 2 years later the algorithm changes again and they lay off the other half of the staff, I think beyond just being cruel to the journalist, it sends a message to your audience that you're not a serious news organization, that you're chasing specific dollars and specific transient business opportunities rather than trying to do the real work of news.
I see your shade and I note it, and I will pick it up in about 5 minutes, but I want to sort of stay with some of the key reportage. Let's talk about those swing states, Alex. Is is reporting more nuanced or more different by virtue of focusing on those states? And what do you think should be the stories to be looking for there? And are they different from, the larger stories that journalists are pursuing around the elections?
I don't know that the stories are more nuanced. I do think that they are. The map of swing states in the US has changed substantially in the last 15 years. And part of what has happened because of the changing political structure and demographics of states like Georgia and Arizona and Virginia and North Carolina is that swing states are actually more demographically diverse than they were a couple decades ago, when you were really talking about states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, which they do have a significant level of diversity, but not like the states of the Sun Belt, right? So Hispanic voters are much more powerful in America than they were 2 decades ago, or even 1 decade ago. Asian American voters are more powerful thanks to states like Georgia and Virginia, Nevada. That doesn't make white voters or black voters less important, but it does. I think it does invite the national media and sort of require the national media to be much more attentive to the range of experiences and priorities and sort of worldviews that are on display in these states. It's one of the really interesting things. I worked at the New York Times during the 2016, 2018, and 2020 elections, and working for a northern newspaper, you do run into some dated assumptions about who lives in the South, right? That there are people who have not been to Atlanta in quite a while, who have a picture of the city as it may have looked in 1980, and now there are parts of Atlanta that look like many parts of Atlanta that look like any sort of heavily diverse global suburban population that you would find in New Jersey or New York. That's a really striking change, and it does force us, require us as a media to adapt to it. One of the things that we've done at Politico that's I think significant in the context of the swing state map is telling policy stories as they are particularly relevant in these geographies. So we have this big ongoing project called Biden's Billions about the massive spending projects that have launched under this administration. The sort of the 4 anchor laws of his tenure, $1.6 trillion authorized and going out the door in places like, there's a massive semiconductor facility in Arizona, electric vehicles and solar power panels in Georgia. It's an opportunity to use those states as a lens on issues like climate, issues like competition with China, as they play out for actual people, because it's all well and good to sort of sit at Brookings and talk about de-risking or supply chain resilience, and it's another thing to go to the Phoenix suburbs and find out, like, so are voters excited about this a Taiwanese semiconductor company coming to town? And the answer is usually yes, but many of them don't know that it's happening.
You've mentioned climate a couple of times, and it is a big one. There is a genuine sort of fear about what happens with climate policy because it's been quite stark difference in approach. What do you think are the real risks of climate policy if we're looking at a Trump re-election? Because it seems like what we've seen with the Biden era is clear in terms of a climate direction. Would you say it would be the same as the previous Trump era, or do you think things would have to change?
I think in terms of the regulatory agenda, it would be quite similar to the first Trump administration, right? Just ripping up EPA regulations and making it easier for fossil fuel-based energy companies to expand and operate without the kind of strict oversight that the Biden administration favors. I think what's different from the first Trump administration is that the dynamics of the energy, the sort of free market dynamics of energy have changed dramatically, in part because of the Inflation Reduction Act here and because of other green energy spending in places across the Western world, where you've had massive industrial policy investments in solar and wind and hydrogen and other clean energy, and the private sector has followed with immense enthusiasm. And so when you talk to Republicans in Washington and around the country, there's real ambivalence about the idea of scaling back the basically private sector subsidies that Biden has put out for clean energy because it is proven such a productive set of policies for the energy sector. And it has created jobs, it has created wealth, places. When you talk to Republicans about the Inflation Reduction Act, there are people who say, yes, we should rip it up. But much more often you hear, like, maybe we should tinker around with subsidy for EV consumers, right? Or maybe we should adjust this tax credit here. It's not, you don't hear Republicans talking about the IRA the way they talked about Obamacare, right? Where as soon as we have power, we should just rip up the whole thing.
Mm. On this point about representation, Alex, one of the hindsight is 2020. One of the observations of the first Trump round was that perhaps one failing for news organizations was not adequately representing what a large part of his support base felt, with context, of course, but the fact that that was perhaps missing in a lot of the mainstream reportage, whether it was on issues of climate, as you say, or on immigration, or even on abortion rights. Is that a lesson that's been learned in this run-up, would you say?
I think mostly yes. Or for anyone who hasn't learned it, I think the structure of American politics has changed sufficiently that it's harder to miss what's going on with Trump's supporters. So back in 2016 and even through 2020, there was a lot of reporting that suggested he was an anomaly. And he clearly isn't at this point, right? He's not sort of fluke that we'll all move on from in a couple months when the election is over, right? So there's no way to cover his campaign as though he's a flash in the pan anymore. I also think that the nature of the Republican Party has changed so much that, back in 2016 and again, even through 2018 and close to 2020, if you were talking to Republican members of Congress, they would all say on the record they were supportive of Trump, or almost all. And then many of them privately would just trash him and he's such a dope or so offensive. There are many, many more elected leaders in the Republican Party now who aren't faking it. Like, they genuinely love Donald Trump. And I think that really changes the experience of reporting on the Republican Party, because you don't have this constant, you don't have the sense that many of them are faking it all the time. And when you think they're faking it, it does drive a certain perception of how real his political power is.
One is Trump and one is Biden, and then the third is the Supreme Court. And there's a lot going on in the coming week, isn't there? There's guns, abortion rights, Trump's immunity. Would that be a space you're watching as a keen sort of pre-election run-up? And do you think it has the potential of dramatically changing things between now and November?
I don't know about dramatically, but I think it, we don't,
You
I had
can
a story.
What dramatic?
No. But I mean, I wrote a story maybe a year and a half ago when Liz Truss came to DC, and she was talking to Republicans about how nervous she was about the trajectory of UK politics. And one thing she was saying in private was that you Americans don't understand, like, in the UK, a political party can get obliterated in a way that just doesn't happen in the United States. And that's true, right? And she should know.
Good enough, yes.
Yeah. And in the US, we just don't have wild swings in public opinion the way we used to, right? Because the country's so polarized. So could the Supreme Court, like, blow the election to pieces? No, I don't think so. But could it, if the Supreme Court rules that Trump is not immune and he does go on trial for the January 6th case, yeah, I think that could have a meaningful effect on the election. The more, and not just because if he's convicted, it'd be very, very serious. But even in the absence of a conviction, the more Trump kind of recedes, one thing that's strange about this particular pair of candidates is that the less voters see Donald Trump, the less swing voters see Donald Trump, the more they can tell themselves that they like him. And the more he is sort of thrust in front of them, like, no, he's not that guy in the TV ads or in your nostalgic view of what 2019 was like. He's on stage and he's ranting about the FBI and sort of belittling women and belittling minorities, saying incredibly offensive things about immigrants. Like, voters don't like that, and swing voters don't like that anyway. And so, to the extent that the Supreme Court and the justice system thrusts January 6th into the center of the general election, yeah, I do think that's a significant challenge for Donald Trump. Politico has organized much of our coverage of Trump around, one of the things that we an advantage we have in being a relatively young publication is that we don't have the same kind of rigidly traditional beat structures that some other news organizations have. So we don't have, over here in the A section, we're going to cover Donald Trump as a candidate, and then over here in a different section of the paper, our legal team is going to cover him as a criminal defendant. Like, he clearly, when he's on the stump, he's a criminal defendant. When he's in the courtroom, he's a candidate, and there's no successful way to cover this campaign that creates that artificial distinction.
You have had, though, some fairly big changes at Politico itself, Alex. In the last year, there have been sort of shifts and changes in your editorial approach. Some colleagues have chosen not to remain with Politico because of that. They see differences in how they'd like to approach their reportage and how Politico would. How are you feeling about that journey ahead of a really critical election, as you said, and any sort of lessons already in place?
I think we feel great about it. I started my career at Politico, then I left and went to the Times, and then I came back to Politico. And the place is so much bigger than it ever was the first time I worked there. And the stakes of what we do are much, much higher. And part of, I came into the role that I'm in September, and part of the burden on this management team is to sufficiently organize and make changes in the newsroom so that we can be successful at clearing the very, very high bar of covering this campaign. I think it's not concerning that all media organizations have voluntary turnover. We're a newsroom of 600 people, and if some people would prefer to operate in a different kind of environment than what we're trying to do now, I think that's totally fine. I think the most important thing that we're doing is, the last time I worked at Politico, there was a sharp division between reporters who covered policy and reporters who covered politics. That if you were a reporter who covered financial regulation or Medicare, you were organized separate and apart from people who covered the presidential election. And we're not doing that anymore. I don't think there's any responsible way to cover politics right now that creates that kind of artificial cleavage between sort of the substance of governing and the drama of politics. And if there are people who feel differently, that's okay. My perception of the direction that the newsroom is going in is that the overwhelming share of people who are anchored in really rigorous and self-exacting coverage of the business of government and the stakes of politics are exhilarated by the kinds of changes that we're making and the ambition and discipline that we're bringing to our report.
You said you haven't had a boring election. You also haven't had a boring sort of journalistic landscape. As we speak, the British are invading the US in every which way. New Washington Post, new Axios scoops every evening. Is this a story for anyone outside the industry, particularly because, it is at a critical moment in time for a newsroom where you do want to have your shoulder to the wheel and completely focused on what's coming up in November, but instead you're dealing with these implosions and these leaks and a lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I think the situation at the Washington Post is in a somewhat different category than a couple other news organizations that are making a great deal of change at the moment. My wife works at CNN, where Mark Thompson is obviously making change. I have good friends who work at the Wall Street Journal, where there are significant changes underway. The Post is different because there are really fundamental questions about sort of ethics and judgment and character at stake, and the internal struggle that they're having right now. I don't think, there may be people who agree or disagree with the changes that we're making at Politico or that Emma Tucker is making at the Wall Street Journal. I don't think anybody is asking whether Emma Tucker misled Scotland Yard or something, right? And so I'm not sort of passing judgment on Will Lewis or on the changes that he's making at the Post, but I do really feel for the newsroom there, because they've been through a lot. This is a really important moment in the life of the Post and the life of Washington, and they're carrying a different burden at the moment.
Okay, I'm going to open up to audiences and questions. Some are coming in online and some are from our fellows. Maybe we can start with our fellows who are sitting in the room just below me, and then we can go to the questions from the wider audiences. Shall we start with Rebecca and then go to Osama?
Hi, my name's Rebecca. Thank you very much for the interesting discussion. I wanted to go back to a comment that you made about readers choosing to eat the food that's good for them or the food that's not good for them. And I wondered what the topics were that you find hardest to attract readers to, and if you're doing anything to increasingly appeal to readers in those cases, whether you're dressing up the vegetables with anything in an attempt to make people eat them.
It's a really great question. So one of the things that I personally enjoy the most in my job is trying to solve for that puzzle that you just described, right? Like, how do you take a subject that is not inherently interesting to people? It's super easy to get people to click on a Trump story, right? It's harder to get people to click on, a story about like retirement savings or something like that, right? And yet, like, one of our most read stories of, I think it was May, was like a sort of sweeping look at how the retirement security industry had romanced Washington and sort of blown a hole in the federal budget in the process, right? And I do think and I'll admit, like, I was surprised. Like, I thought it was a very good story, and I thought, like, this is a laudable piece of work, and I hope that somebody reads it. And like hundreds of thousands of people read it. And I do think that there is a lesson there in, finding policy stories that are closer to home for people, right? Where there are really important policy stories that, no matter how hard you sell them, a couple hundred people are going to care, right? But retirement security is actually something that everybody can relate to, right? I think we found this at times in our coverage of like electric vehicles or certainly student loans, like issues where sort of the specifics of which kind of loan forgiveness did Joe Biden do? How is it faring in the courts? Like, may seem pretty esoteric to people, but the affordability of going to school or buying a home or buying a car is all quite immediate for people. The one that's the hardest and the most important, the one that is the hardest among the ones that are the most important, I think, is international news, right? And we're doing a ton of reporting on the relationship between the US and Europe and the war in Ukraine and the future of NATO. And that's one where, because of who Politico's core readership is, our readers do respond to that, right? I think it's harder if you are a big television network or a general interest newspaper to say, like, you, a man or woman on the street in Los Angeles, like, here's why you should care about like cybersecurity in Estonia or something, right? And that takes some doing.
Osama, you're up next.
Yeah, thank you so much for the conversation. So the question I have is for the scheduled debates. One is later this week, and I think the other one is for September. But since we have known like these two candidates for a long time, I mean, Joe Biden has been in public office before I was born. I'm already getting old, and like he was in the Senate, vice president, and now the president. And for Donald Trump, he was the president and waiting to become the next president, like for the last 4 years. And it's very different from Keir Starmer, the head, like the leader of the Labour Party you hardly know. So my question is, like, what is it that we're expecting to learn from the debate, since we already know these candidates for a long time?
I think it goes back overwhelmingly to the sort of age and mental acuity question, right? That I think there are, when you talk to people, even people who are quite close to Biden and very supportive of Biden, they will acknowledge that like, he has slowed down relative to 10 years ago, right? And people who will say, like, if this was the Biden of 2008, he'd be mopping the floor with Donald Trump, right? And that's just not what's happened in this campaign. Um, I think we'll see how he does tomorrow, and then you optimistically noted that we have a debate scheduled for September. I think there's a lot of skepticism in the U.S. that debate will actually happen. That there's a lot of room for somebody to back out of that. So the one we have tomorrow may be the only one. And then on the Trump side, I do think he is a really significant difference between the Donald Trump who's running now and the Donald Trump who ran in 2016. In 2016, he would pick up the phone and talk to anybody. He would talk to outlets that he saw as hostile to him. He was just had like boundless enthusiasm for engaging the media and sort of boundless confidence for engaging the media. And he has not operated that way this time around. He's talking to friendly outlets. He's giving speeches in a relatively, totally friendly environment, right? And so he has not really been challenged aggressively. We'll see how how aggressively the moderators do push him, and we'll see how aggressively Biden pushes him. But one of the things that you do see pretty consistently in American politics, you saw it in 2004 when George Bush was running for re-election. You saw it in 2012 when Obama was running for re-election, that frequently the incumbent president loses the first debate because he goes in cocky and underprepared and sort of sealed in a bubble. These are two guys who have both been sealed in a bubble for a really long time. So I do just think that turning them out into the wild and seeing how well they survive is in a lot of ways going to be the major test.
I have a question which has nothing to do with age, but has everything to do with TikTok. Most recent numbers show that news consumption by TikTok as a platform has increased from last year. So now bumping at about 9% for the US as a market. Is it your reading that either party or candidate used TikTok as a medium to reach out to young voters? And do you think it's going to be a bone of contention what the Biden government's approach has been to TikTok versus what Trump seems to be indicating, which is, I love it, I have no problem with it?
I think it will. First of all, I think that Trump and generally, not necessarily literally the Trump campaign, but the political right, has used TikTok and other social media quite effectively to mock Biden for his age and take videos out of context that make him look like even older than he is. And I do think that's a challenge for Biden. I think that that's not just about TikTok. That's true of other social media. It's true of Fox News, but I think TikTok is particularly challenging. The Biden operation does have a aggressive social media presence of a kind, but there is something much more conventional about the kind of political communication that is happening on the Democratic side in this race. So there are things that they do on Twitter, or I guess now it's X, or on TikTok that it's not that it's bad, it's just that it would have been edgy maybe 6 years ago, right? So I do think the Republicans are mixing it up a little bit more. In terms of the regulation of TikTok, I think that's one of the really, really interesting bouncing balls in this election, right? Because on the one hand, it's a very popular product. And on the other hand, I think it's widely seen as kind of a toxic product, right? So I think we genuinely don't know. Will Biden pay more of a price for being anti-TikTok than Trump does for being, you could see it being characterized as like indifferent to mental illness or mental health issues associated with TikTok, like it's dangerous to kids. There's stuff on there that happens that's clearly violent or obscene in different ways, and it's owned by China, right? So that feels like I wouldn't want to even attempt to guess at how that will play out.
Back to the room then, and there's a question from Caitlin, our Associate Director of the program.
Hey, Alex. Thanks so much for your time today. We had a Chatham House Rules seminar earlier at the start of the year with a prominent professor of politics who said, in the history of US politics, there has never been an incumbent president presiding over a good economy and scandal-free who has lost his seat. And for that reason, he was very confident that it was going to be Biden, willing to put all his money on Biden. Do you think that holds up now halfway through the year? And follow-up, kind of related to what's happening in the UK news, would an American journalist ever place a bet on a presidential outcome?
On the second one, I think certainly yes. Like I don't think they should, but it's a big industry, and it takes all kinds. So yeah, I do think that probably has happened. A candidate betting against himself is a different story, right? I'm not sure that we've had that here. To your first, I have a little bit of difficulty with some of these sort of history-based axioms about who loses and who doesn't, mostly because we're dealing with quite a small sample of elections to work from, right? So a scandal-free president presiding over a growing economy is not lost in modern times. Like we're not talking about we're talking about 3 or 4 people, right? If it's all of American history, I guess it's a little bit more persuasive, but the country has changed so much that I'm not sure how relevant like the trends of 1900 were are to understanding the election today. There used to be this, I guess there still is, it's like no president with unemployment under 8 has ever lost re-election. And it looked like Obama was going to be the first to survive. And then like the week before the election, it ticked down to like 7.9 or something. And like, is that a useful way for understanding what happened to that? I'm not sure. I do think if Biden wins, it will be what you just said, that he's perceived as an honest president, or at least not convicted criminal, and that things are improving, right? Or that things are good enough that it's not worth the gamble. Where I think Biden has clearly run into trouble is trying to tell people that things are fantastic, because that's just not how voters feel.
One final question before we let you go, Alex. In the run-up to the last sort of Trump election, I think for a lot of journalists who were on the ground, who were reporting from conventions and rallies, there were lots of what the moments. Some of that then came to fruit in his own governance, and there was so much fact-checking that needed to be done on a daily basis. In your recent run-up to the Trump versus Biden election this time round, has there been sort of a surreal moment where you're thinking, if my readers could see what I'm seeing, and I mean this for either side, Biden or Trump, did you have a moment like that where you just needed to sit down and hold your head?
It's a good question because because I'm in management now, I'm not present for this stuff in the way I was in 2016. And in 2016, like, I mean, you said it better than I would have. That was just well, we all remember that election. No, I think my colleagues who were in the courtroom with Trump, right, seeing someone who was not that long ago one of the most powerful people on the planet, like hunched over, dozing in his chair, swearing about what's going on in the courtroom. Yeah, I think that is a pretty surreal thing, right? And that's not because of the sort of like in 2016, the like unbridled, norm-breaking attack dog Trump. It's because he was so kind of reduced, right? And Americans have never seen a former president like that before, and certainly not one who's also a candidate. So I wasn't there for it. I would have liked to be there for it because I do think it's one of those things that we may never see again.
Fantastic. We wish you luck. You don't have an easy couple of months ahead of you, Alex. We're coming out of the elections in India, and I can guarantee that drama is sort of universal in nature with elections. But thank you very much for joining in today, for speaking with us, and we'll be tracking the Politico coverage.
Thank you so much.
For everyone watching, goodbye. See you in some days now. This is almost the end of our summer term. It's been fantastic having our journalists and, of course, our fabulous guests on the seminar. Goodbye.